It's a wonderful honor to talk to the Prudentialist. His first name is Matthew, so I suppose from now on I shall address him as such. He is a writer, a YouTuber, and a fisherman, and a very interesting thinker in the internet conservative sphere. We are discussing the wonderful and perhaps much maligned conservative thinker, Joseph Sobran. Mr. Prudentialist, Matthew, it's an honor. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me on. When you had emailed me about talking about Joseph Sobran, I think it was a few weeks prior to what has gone on in the news. So it feels rather timely that the things that had gotten Joseph Sobran, I suppose, in the early proto form of cancel culture, canceled, that, we're going to be discussing him. And so I was going through his writings and going through a book of his about singular essays about subtracting Christianity. So it'll be interesting. I look forward to it.
Okay. Yeah. So I was introduced to you and your work via the episode that you did with Paul Gottfried in the Chronicles magazine podcast, where the topic.
I did that with one of their editors, CJ Engel. I have not had the pleasure of speaking to Dr. Gottfried directly, although I'm a big fan of his work.
Yeah, me too. I've had the pleasure of talking to him twice on this show, and he's a wonderfully refreshing mind.
Yes.
So first off, so why the Prudentialist?
Well, two reasons primarily. One of them is sort of to give homage to sort of an influence of mine, a colleague as well. It's kind of strange that for many younger individuals who were looking into politics, a lot of them in their, who are 30 or younger will typically get into it via the internet. And one of those individuals came from a man named Dave Green, who goes by the Distributist on his blog and his writings. And I myself am not a Roman Catholic, so as much as I appreciate the Chesterton posting and things like that, I thought, well, why not try something a little different? And I thought about one of my biggest influences when I was in college, of course, was Edmund Burke's Reflections on the French Revolution. And he had talked about, the inherited rights of man, that who are we to change, what comes before us in the lives of those who have yet to be born. So the prudence of forethought has always been in my mind of politics. And so the Prudentialist came to that mind that, we're to be prudent in our thinking in the way that we approach the world realistically. And then the profile picture is just sort of an amphibious depiction of the late but great Austrian thinker and diplomat Clemens von Metternich, who is one of my personal favorite interesting heroes of history. He's an influence on me. He's a big influence on Henry Kissinger. It was his bachelor's senior thesis on. And I cover international relations, cultural issues. I'm really interested in how, much like Marshall McLuhan or Harold Innis, we're influenced by our mechanisms of communication. And I think that's what makes politics so both very polarized, but very interesting in 2023, that we exist in a medium that really discourages us from looking back long term. Because if you were to ask a lot of other conservatives who are, say, early millennial or Gen Z like myself, who's going on 28 this coming month, I would tell you that a lot of people haven't read people like Joseph Sobran, or haven't read people like In Defense of Freedom and other essays by Frank S. Meyer and the like. So the internet really does discourage us from having, I think, an intellectual canon when it comes to politics. And I think that's why it's really important for people to maybe take a step back from the digital and read more. So that's what I like to do, is to read these old texts and to understand, how did we get to where we are politically, but also how much of what we're talking about right now in our current political zeitgeist are sort of these parallelisms, or, they say poetry doesn't, history doesn't repeat itself, but it's like poetry, it rhymes, like George Lucas says. And so I just that's why I've been rather interested in Joe Sobran and reading his work, because he does feel like a man, while maligned and canceled for a variety of reasons, which I'm sure we'll talk about today. He is one of those characters that I think has a great canon of work that isn't just explicitly political. I mean, he's written on everything from Shakespeare to baseball, and you kind of need a well-rounded writer and political character. And I think Pat Buchanan was very correct to say after he died in 2010 that he was one of the best writers and columnists of his time.
Let's see. So I'm assuming that you identify yourself as an American conservative. So here's my observation. I think most, if not all, American conservatives pay homage to Edmund Burke and the Reflections. I certainly do. Um, Nevertheless, I don't think that American conservatives today, at least from the mainstream angle, are practicing Burkeans the same way as I guess all international relations majors or major players or scholars pay homage to George Kennan, but I don't think any of them like really take his words into heart. So I wonder if that is an observation that you can expand upon.
Sure, I would agree with both of those statements that a lot of people don't take Kennan or Edmund Burke very seriously in that respect. George Kennan, of course, and also another personal hero of mine. One of my favorite works is Around the Cragged Hill, which is more of a personal reflection on his political philosophy and his work. I mean, he is one of those first generation foreign service officers. He's also sort of the story of American social mobility because he's born, in the beginning of the 20th century in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which of course is not a place that was known to be a great intellectual powerhouse and whatnot, out in the middle of the Midwest. Of course, served for decades in the Foreign Service and was an expert in Russian history. And of course, famously before he died, he had written in the end of the Cold War about NATO expansion and the concerns about how to deal with Russia. And many biographers of him have sort of, saw him as a very pensive, but also very conservative and somewhat reactionary man of his time, kind of this anti-democratic figure, but one that realistically understood how to interact with others on the world stage. And we certainly don't follow that anymore because I think that our class of foreign service officers do not abide by a more realistic school of understanding. This is why, very famously, more modern day realists like Dr. John J. Mearsheimer have been asked in interviews, has anyone from the government ever listened to you or asked you to come over? And he's sort of laughed rather famously that no one's ever listened to his work. Even if Mearsheimer's wrong about things, you'd think that a man who has a pretty voluminous body of work on some of the consequences of, say, liberal hegemony should be listened to. The same with Edmund Burke. And I think a big reason for that has been, on one hand, I think sort of this ideological or political hubris that the United States emerges after the end of the Cold War, and we sell this really good narrative to ourselves. And this is something that George Kennan had, reflected upon in 1950 in his lectures called American Diplomacy. The United States is really good at selling this warm fuzzy to the American people, that we're fighting a force for good, we're doing what's right. As Dr. Gottfried would say, we're on this great global crusade for anti-fascism. And, if it looks like you're the guy who's won the game of King of the Hill, you can afford to play a little fast and loose. Who's going to challenge you? And now that we live in an age where there once again are concerns about challenges and about politics, we're beginning to see some people, mainly conservatives. I mean, Victor Davis Hanson has written about this, alongside even more mainstream foreign policy gurus like Elbridge Colby, look to George Kennan, look to Edmund Burke, and realize that we are very far off the political tradition that we are on. And in part because the political tradition we've been on, that most conservatives, I think, would argue since the FDR days of the Great Depression, we've radically departed from those traditions of, say, Burkean-style conservatism, or even the more radical counter-Enlightenment thinkers such as Joseph de Maistre, to recognize that, well, what we have now has no semblance to what once came before. And this is where you get even liberal thinkers, or some might call him liberal, William Appleman Williams, who wrote in The Tragedy of American Diplomacy and Empire as a Way of Life, that, we have departed from these traditions in pursuits of a more global, market-oriented ideology, and that comes with severe consequences on the world stage and at home. And so it is very interesting to see that these diverse thinkers, both Kennan, Burke, FDR, Bill Williams, everyone's sort of looking at history now and recognizing that we are way off track from those traditions. And whether or not we can get back on them has been, I guess, the big question for a lot of political thinkers and writers of the last 60 years.
Yeah, I certainly agree. So since you mentioned John Mearsheimer, I think I'm not sure if he identifies himself as a conservative, but he and
Oh
so
no, he was famously for Bernie Sanders in the
oh yes,
2016
yes,
election, saying
that too.
that income inequality is a national security threat and must be addressed.
Mhm,
He and other realists like Stephen Walt, I think, would be very much characterized as liberals.
mhm, yes, but nevertheless, I think him, Mearsheimer, and Sobran shares in common, like I think their animosity towards the pro-Israel crowd of American policy, much less American society. Yeah. So that brings us to why and how I was introduced to Sobran to begin with, and this was from a small volume by the great conservative himself, William F. Buckley, is titled "In Search of Anti-Semitism," where Sobran, who was, I believe, he served as editor and writer of National Review magazine at that time, and Buckley was calling him out alongside Pat Buchanan, who you've mentioned, great conservative figure, as anti-Semites because of, well, their opposition to Israel. So how would you put Sobran's position regarding Israel in context?
I think that the big thing that really would do in Sobran towards the end is his speaking at the Institute for Historical Review. But in respects to William F. Buckley's piece in book on In the Search of Anti-Semitism, he goes after three characters primarily in sort of the search for, well, where does it exist? Where can we find it in the West? And it calls, of course, out Pat Buchanan, Gore Vidal, a very liberal writer, and that of Joe Sobran. Joe Sobran's position, like many, I would suppose, traditionalist and conservative Catholics of his time, identified that there is a relationship to the nation state of Israel post 1948 that has been fundamentally not in America's favor, nor does it serve America's interest. He had written essays on the foreign policy of President Johnson alongside, throughout the rest of his life and writing career, that the relationship that we have with the Israeli state has been predominantly associated with a heavy lobby that serves to, make sure that America's tax dollars and America's foreign policy serves the interest more so of that of Israel than it does the United States. And this is where, of course, Buckley is writing about this and the emergence of neoconservatism out of the 1960s and 70s. So you get gentlemen like Norman Podhoretz and his son, who would later write for George H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan, if I remember correctly. And, this sort of foreign policy oriented neoconservatism, which even in 2003, Max Boot would write in the Wall Street Journal, what in the heck is a neoconservative? And they'll say flat out, it is primarily a foreign policy based ideology on that's pro-Israel. Joe Sobran, of course, being a conservative Catholic, being primarily oriented in criticizing them, he had said in C-SPAN in an interview about accusations of anti-Semitism that I criticize Catholics, but if I am to criticize, say, a particular lobby, the Israel lobby or a Jewish lobby, that I get labeled an anti-Semite. And for him, he views this as a kind of, quote, alienism, or what maybe Roger Scruton would call oikophobia, the fear of homeland, that we are meant to be attached to, alien ideas or alien nations and peoples as a way to, assert our dominance or to be attracted to them and to root out other things. And I think this is best explained in his essay, Notes for the Reactionary of Tomorrow, which he wrote in the 80s, about we were on this pursuit to stomp out Nazism. We're on this pursuit to ensure that, the alien aspects of our society are pursued. This is why McCarthyism had failed and so on and so forth. But I think Joe Sobran's, anti-Semitism is the sort of, like you had mentioned, sort of the Stephen Walt, John J. Mearsheimer, Pat Buchanan understanding that there is a substantial lobbying effort in our relationship to the United States. There's a lot of Jewish, or at least ethnically Jewish, maybe not practicing Judaism and academia and in foreign policy that disproportionately leads to foreign policy initiatives that are, in Sobran's view, disastrous to the United States. And he has what we would call in England, right? Like Little Englandism. You want to be more reserved, restrained, isolationist. And for Joe Sobran, that lobby is not good for us. It gets us more entangled into the Middle East. And of course, what happened in Libya under the Reagan administration and the death of, over 200 Marines, he views that as a consequence of our ongoing relationship to the Israelis. And that, of course, as we've seen throughout the history of American politics on foreign policy in the Middle East, that tends to lead to accusations of anti-Semitism. And then he kind of does light the match, I think, in terms of his public-facing career when he speaks at the Institute of Historical Review later in his life.
Well, just to fill in for those who do not know, I think that's a sort of like body founded by one David Irving, right? There's a famous
David Irving and Mark Webber and a few others, which originally I think was actually started by the more far right writer Willis Carto, and that has its own history that people can look into. But they're most famously called Holocaust denialists, and to which he was given a speech there. Sobran's famous, position was, "You should judge me on the content of my words, not who I speak them to." And of course, Sobran had said to himself that he is a believer that that event had actually happened, and that he wants to pursue the truth of what had taken place during World War II in the same way that Soviet crimes had been either over-exaggerated or underreported. But of course, as Gottfried writes in Anti-Fascism, that any sort of questioning of the the mainstream political narrative over World War II and the Holocaust is one of those things that you just cannot do. And even today, despite all of the rampant social media discussions from Elon Musk on Twitter or X over the ADL or the war against Hamas and the Gaza Strip, even then, those are things that on the Overton window are even far beyond most people's willing to discuss them. And so as I think it's a Catholic magazine that had called it, I think it was back in a few years ago, that all of us, if we were to go look back at Joseph Sobran, he is a man that lit the match under his own, pile of stakes that he had tied himself to. And I think that that's something to definitely consider in this respect, is that he has a voluminous amount of work, and then in the public face of all things, because he was willing to talk to these individuals, that it came at the cost of his public image and public disavowals. And I mean, even when he died in 2010, numerous obituaries, I think I think the New York Times had just said, Holocaust denier, Joe Sobran died at age so-and-so in 2010. But I do think that despite that, there are works about his on American culture and Christianity, or C.S. Lewis, or issues regarding abortion or liberalism that are still worth recovering from. I mean, in the same way that much as Sobran loves William Shakespeare and thinks that Shakespeare may have been an alias and other people, we could look at, say, the Merchant of Venice and understand that there's still great literary work in that, despite attitudes towards Jewish merchants in the Middle Ages.
Yes. So since you mentioned what's going on currently in the Middle East, yes, we're currently talking as the war between Israel and Hamas is raging for a month now. The situation there is terrible. But so from your perspective in the United States and me in Hungary, so what do you suppose we can take from Joe Sobran when observing the situation?
Well, I think if Joe Sobran were alive today, I think he would be probably on twitter.com or trying to write on his own Substack, since he had been canceled in so many places, since that's where Substack can be the great place for people to go to without fear of cancellation. I mean, even Rod Dreher, who is by all means not a Joe Sobran type at all, after he was left the American Conservative, he has his own blog on Substack. I'm sure he would be writing and explicating and reiterating his thesis that the Israel lobby has the likelihood to drag America further into conflict into the Middle East. And I mean, the United States, since this conflict has started, of course, has sent aid, has reprioritized its diplomatic and political efforts towards Israel rather than just Ukraine or Taiwan, and has had a drone shot down by Houthi rebels that is pretty much the government in place in the territorial boundaries in the state of Yemen, which is supported by the Iranians. And our entire political, discourse over foreign policy has shifted towards, Biden's, not very strong on X issue, as we've seen in the Republican primary debates. And they're now focusing on Israel to a point where Nikki Haley, the former governor of South Carolina, former ambassador to the United Nations under Trump, has been so bold to say that, there is no United States without Israel. There is no Israel without the United States. And so Soberin would probably be resting on sort of his political laurels, I think, saying that, my point has been proven that there has been this lobby that is disastrous for American foreign policy. And I think that that's probably similar to what we saw during the early years of when Stephen Walt and John G. Mearsheimer wrote famously The Israel Lobby back in 2008, if I remember correctly. And so, I mean, for us in America, there has been still a great issue that a lot of Jewish conservatives and Jewish liberals have noted, that there has been a rampant rise of quote unquote anti-Semitism in the college campuses, a lot of protests that are pro-Palestine to a degree where it's almost pro-Hamas, which no one should be supporting terrorist organizations. But there is this sort of progressive dichotomy about the oppressor-oppressed dynamic and the intersectionality of a lot of contemporary critical theory inside progressivism, that a lot of these people don't view it as a specifically Jewish issue or an identitarian issue. They view it as a, patriarchal white settler colonialism against an oppressed people of color type deal with the Palestinians. And so, you do see a lot of prominent Jewish intellectuals in Tablet Magazine and commentary ask the same thing. And I think that Joe Soberin and myself included, I think we're witnessing sort of a rhyming scheme to history, because we saw during the civil rights movement, very famously, Norman Podhoretz wrote an essay, called Our Negro Problem and Mine, or My Negro Problem and Ours. Yeah. Which is a very famous essay. It's actually well worth reading to understand sort of the relationship between the African American community and the Jewish community in the United States. But that's sort of where you get to see the emergence of neoconservatism break off in the aftermath of the civil rights era, and especially with affirmative action and the nation state of Israel, and how those two groups don't necessarily see eye to eye on those issues. Murray Friedman, who was a famous civil rights attorney and worked for a lot of Jewish groups, wrote a book in 1995 called What Went Wrong? The Creation and the Collapse of the Black-Jewish Alliance. And he cites Podhoretz and others in the midst of those issues in the 60s and 70s being the catalyst for neoconservatism. And so I think you're beginning to see that again, where a lot of people who are very concerned about their identity, obviously the territory for their people has been attacked, and they're witnessing progressives, which a lot of people who go to university who are protesting these things, I think safe to say label them as progressive, are, coming out with these anti-Israeli positions. And for them, they see that as, of course, an existential threat to their identity and being, but they don't see it really as a Jewish thing. So I think we're witnessing a very similar moment to Podhoretz, Our Negro Problem, or My Negro Problem and Ours, but this time it's sort of a progressive problem and ours. But I think time remains to be seen whether or not, say, Soberin's words will be validated, or this thing plays out and we see some kind of new neoconservatism, neoconservatism, whatever it may be. Again, everything is still playing out, but I think that because our social media environment isn't like the 1960s, it isn't, with the text, it isn't with the magazines, it's on Twitter, it's on YouTube, it's everywhere. It's a lot more complicated, because we're no longer relying on just like one sole intellectual authority. We're not just relying on William F. Buckley. We're not just relying on the Podhoretzes, right? We're not just relying on one editor at the National Review. Anyone can do this, right? You can do this. You have your own philosophy podcast. I have my own work. A lot of progressives have their own work. There's a YouTube channel out there called like Midwestern Marks, that's got like thousands of more subscribers than I do. So it illustrates that anyone really can be the voice for a specific camp or ideal, which makes, I think, for us in general, as just people who exist in a politically charged world, to be very mindful of the history of the intellectual tradition that came before us. Because for a lot of people, if you ask them on the political right or even the left, where did you get started on these ideas? They may say it was some moment online. A lot of, conservatives on Twitter or on YouTube might say, oh, it was the era of quote unquote Gamergate in 2014, this quote unquote great awakening. But again, if that's the only time that you've just started observing things and that's your year zero, you don't really have a good history of what came before. And that's very dangerous. And I think that it's important for us to consider the works of Sobran or Buchanan or even Gore Vidal and other progressive writers to see, well, where are the seminal roots, so to speak, of these ideas?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So a little bit more on the current situation. I think when it comes to picking sides between Israel and Hamas, I think being on the side of Israel is better because Hamas is generally a terrorist group. Now, my concern, and I think this is Sobran's concerns too, is that for a multitude of reasons, being supportive of Israel has become sort of like a marker of your membership in the conservative movement. And if you say anything that's remotely critical about the state of Israel, you are driven out of the movement, so to speak. And of course, that happened to Buchanan, that happened to Sobran, and other members too. I believe Robert Novak is one of them as well.
Yeah.
And I think that's very, very dangerous. And in fact, I know that Douglas Murray, who's a conservative thinker in Britain that I really enjoy reading, he has openly called for people who support Hamas to be expelled from the UK, basically. Obviously, that's a wrong decision to take, but I think for that to really happen, I think that's a kind of McCarthyism, and I think American conservatives, especially motivated by its more neoconservative elements, are heading to that path regarding positions on Israel, Palestine, and all that.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that, as I think that we've witnessed again what Sobran would call alienism, this desire to be focused on foreign ideas or foreign peoples rather than our own. And this is where you've seen sort of that, say, less neoconservative or less Israel-friendly position. You can pay lip service to say that, Israel has the right to exist, has the right to defend itself, as we often see with those that are critical of our position. I mean, I don't think, Congressman Thomas Massey of Kentucky is a particularly anti-Semitic person. But, he gets a lot of flack from, AIPAC, the American Israeli Political Action Committee, this political lobby that pushes for more pro-Israeli candidates, because he wants to focus the money on at home and to be very clear where this cash is going, that he gets targeted for it. And he famously replied, I think, to an AIPAC tweet criticizing him to just with the Wikipedia link for the Foreign Agents Registration Act in the United States, which I thought was quite humorous. But I would agree to an extent that, of course, it's better not to support the terrorist organization, but also it means that American politicians also are in a really strange position to where, you don't want, of course, Hamas to succeed in their goals, which, again, remain to be seen what their goals are, other than tanking U.S.-Israeli foreign policy in the region. I think that as we're at the time of this recording, Hamas's biggest victory has been essentially tearing up the Abraham Accords and making relations between Israel and the Arab world incredibly cool. And to see the Arab world and the Muslim world come together, and to see Iran and Saudi Arabia meet in, Riyadh for the first time in 11 years, is, of course, very concerning. It really does tank the Biden administration and sort of the progressive position in America for a liberal foreign policy to pursue an Iran nuclear agreement. And then, of course, there is this political class that really started to emerge in Barack Obama's administration about the uneasiness or the difficult relationship between Benjamin Netanyahu, or sort of the right-wing Likud party inside of Israel, and sort of the Democratic administration, especially with Barack Obama, which, again, that sort of Black-Jewish relationship sort of showing its tenseness there again. And so with respects to Joe Sobran, I think that, as he had said, when he even criticized Bill Buckley's book about In Search of Anti-Semitism, that, he said in 2002 for the American Enterprise Institute that, Bill Buckley never bothered to define what anti-Semitism is. And that's certainly a concern that he had raised, and that he had witnessed Bill Buckley be more critical of the Israeli foreign policy and its project to being what he called a servile appeaser. But his concern is that, listen, I focus on, as it's been said by Trump and by other political and conservative commentators, I'm more America first. And if I'm to criticize, say, dual loyalty to politicians that either have a closer tie to Israel than they do America, or Israeli actors having more of a close tie to Israel than being American citizens, saying that that's dual loyalty is, quote, anti-Semitic. And that was a concern that he had during his lifetime, was that apparently it's anti-Semitic to say that, there is an obvious dual loyalty there. And he had compared it to being anti-Soviet, saying, quote, it serves a similar function to facilitating imputations of ill-defined guilt. And so Joe Sobran, I think, would be very much similarly quoting and being on the side of, say, Tucker Carlson on Twitter, that there is clearly a lot of issues with mass immigration that promote, both, say, anti-white or anti-Western European peoples, as well as Jewish identity, that has been propped up by a lot of progressive Jewish academics in the United States university system. Noel Ignatieff saying about abolishing the white race and so on and so forth. Joe Sobran would probably be just pointing to his essays and receipts saying the same thing. But I think it's in the best interest of the United States and for most people to be carefully treading the line to ensure that we don't get involved in a further conflict. The Biden administration under Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, the one good thing I can definitely say about Blinken and them has that he's been very good to limit and try and constrain the conflict to a regional one. He doesn't want this to expand into sort of a quagmire where America gets dragged into the Middle East for the third time, or really the fourth time since the 1990s. And we've been there. That was the culmination of my father's entire military career in the U.S. Army, was Desert Storm all the way to getting ready to pull out of Afghanistan. So to see 40 years of American being involved in the Middle East in some kind of conflict, Blinken's been trying to push back on, and I think that would be something that even Joe Sobran, is conservative and paleo-conservative as he is, would be supporting Blinken and trying to keep this conflict regionally contained and to not get America dragged into any major kind of boots on the ground engagement outside of what we already have.
Mm-hmm. Now, speaking of Black-Jewish relations and conflict, I woke up this morning with the news of the internal fighting in the Daily Wire between Ben Shapiro, who's Orthodox Jewish, and Candace Owens, who's a Black woman. I think that's very much motivated by what's going on in Israel at the moment. So with that in mind, I wonder if a definition of anti-Semitism can be given, especially in relations to, say, one's views on Israel, that you can give.
I think that when we consider anti-Semitism, I think that the best word, and of course, there are more than just Semitic peoples other than Jews, but of course, anti-Semite is very clearly defined towards Jewish individuals. And I think that the standard dictionary definition of hostility or discrimination against Jews as a religious or racial group is a very fair definition to apply here. And I don't think Candace Owens is a hater of the Jewish people or of the religion of Judaism itself. I think that Candace Owens, at least based on her tweets, and this is not something I've been following very closely, although to see her quote the New Testament, she was tweeting out the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the peacemakers, that should be called children of God. And that you cannot serve God and mammon, famously, words by the God man, of course, which Orthodox Jews reject. To see the Daily Wire, editor emeritus, and of course one of the founders, simply say, if you getting close to God and work with the Daily Wire's conflict of interest, you can go back and forth. There's been video footage that's been leaked out saying that this faux sophistication makes her look really stupid or arrogant from Ben Shapiro. And then of course she was on Tucker Carlson, and she had I think a pro-Israeli or a Jewish comedian on her show as well discussing these issues. And I think that her primary concern is asking a question that her and Tucker Carlson raised, that, listen, there is a progressive ideology, and this anti-colonialist ideology comes for both, white Western European peoples as well as Jews. And however, historically, there's been this sort of promotion of this ideology from a lot of Jewish academics and ideas in the United States. And so this feels like there's this hoisting of their own petard kind of situation going on. But I don't think Candace Owens, is an anti-Semite in that instance. I mean, there are some individuals like Bethany Mandel who said on Twitter, that if you're pro-Christianity, that's inherently anti-Semitic. And of course, that goes into the entire relationship between the Christian church and the Judaism as we know it after the Second Temple collapse. And that's a whole other, can of worms to go into. But I think it does iterate the sort of difficult history between African Americans, both conservative and liberal, and their relationship to Jews in general. I mean, on Israel especially, one can go back to Jimmy Carter and the Andrew Young affair. I mean, being the ambassador to the United Nations, this former black mayor goes out of his way to speak with the Palestinian Liberation Authority, pretty much against, the orders of the president, against the official U.S. policy, and of course, forcing him to step down because of it. There's this uneasy inter-ethnic conflict between that group, and it has been there really since sort of the beginning of that relationship, this tension, both on grounds of Christianity, but also on grounds of autonomy and agency between, say, African American leaders and the Jewish community. There's a chapter in that book from Murray Friedman called Garvey's Ghosts, in reference to Marcus Garvey. So there's clearly some tensions even to today, but the interesting thing to me is that how the progressive coalition works, the sort of intersectionality where it doesn't matter if you're like a single issue voter and you're about ending, the cruelty of manufactured industrial grade farming, because you see that, you think of the Sarah McLachlan in the eyes of Arms of an Angel music video, right? You get really emotional about it. That can now be a feminist position, that can be an anti-racist position, that can be an anti-colonialist position. So as much as we see these inter-ethnic squabbles, majority of the time, because of how the progressive political machine works and with patronage, they tend to be still voting towards the Democratic side or the left of American politics, and with not much change. But again, I think that as all this unfolds, we should pay very close attention, because we do have, in America at least, a historical record to the birth of neoconservatism. And if we do see deportations in Europe of, say, primarily individuals from Islamic countries that hate, the Jewish people, or hate Christianity, or hate the European, culture and background and traditions and peoples, I would be very pleasantly surprised to see that happen. But I think only time will tell.
So I think from reading Sobran, as well as from my conversations with Gottfried, and from this conversation, I detect that let's say that I think the neoconservatives, as much as they've gained like a tremendous amount of influence during what I would call the unipolar moment of America, to borrow neoconservative Charles Krauthammer, between the period of, say, 91 to 2003. So they've gained a virtual monopoly of influence in the conservative movement, and I'm very surprised, although in hindsight I shouldn't have been that surprised, how they've burned through that influence almost like rapidly after Bush and the second intervention in Iraq. And I think part of that reason is their, I think, fervor in removing certain non-neoconservative elements in the conservative movement, unfortunately aided by William F. Buckley. So people like Buchanan and Sobran, and obviously Gottfried. And I think we, and I'm assuming that you are of the same like age group as I am, we grew up with the certain disillusion of what the neoconservatives stood for. And we think that, well, their way is not the way of the conservatives.
Oh, yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I don't know how old you are. I turn 28 next month, but
24. I just turned 24.
Oh, there. Okay, so yeah, roughly same age group. And so I as someone, I grew up with a father in the military. I grew up sort of this nominally, you vote for the guy with the R next to his name type of deal. I have a little mug somewhere in my time of political activism when I was younger of George W. Bush saying, "Do you miss me yet?" And I look back and I just cringe, like you kind of just look back and you're just, as an adult, I feel like a lot of my political understanding of the world is trying to deconstruct or understand what did I just grow up under and through. And it's definitely trying to make sense of these interventions, making understanding of our foreign policy, and how does that relate to us back at home. I mean, there's a great book written by a man that I usually will have issues with, Richard Haass, who worked for George W. Bush and is the former president of the Council of Foreign Relations. And he wrote a book in 2014 called Foreign Policy Begins at Home. And even a professional, foreign policy writer, think tank, white paper kind of guy is writing this book saying, we have to focus on the home. And this is in the second term of Barack Obama when this is published. And to me, that was sort of a very young wake-up call. I was 18 at the time, I was in college, and to say, wow, to see the professionals also start to look inwardly after, 10 plus years of war with little to nothing to show for it, I thought was a very prominent thing. And so, Joe Soberin, of course, is always looking towards the home and is looking towards the fact that, much like Gottfried in his book about anti-fascism, that at the end of World War II and the 20th century writ large was the destruction of traditional Christianity, both in its Protestant and its Catholic forms. And we've witnessed the great destruction of our traditions as Americans or as Westerners, and this great canon of thought is being destroyed for this new age sort of what I would probably call millenarian or chiliastic, this sort of utopia on earth type deal that we see out of a lot of progressivism, has replaced it. And in doing so, liberalism becomes the new format of how we're to approach the world. And so, he leaves this to being, we make room to accommodate sister ideologies without endorsing them. And again, this is Joe Soberin writing about, being, alienists. That we, liberalism will accommodate sister ideologies without endorsing them. It's bound to insist on a real peril to humanity as some form of nativism. This accounts for the obsession of the Nazi period, the endless search for old Nazis, the wild alarm, and the eccentric expression of neo-Nazism. And he refers to this about South Africa and its apartheid system. But he says, we don't have to choose between nativism and alienism. A healthy native isn't an all-out nativist, but he respects others, but he focuses on himself, which is the United States. And I feel like that's the big turning point that came at the end of sort of Barack Obama's term and the political attitudes on the left and the right, because it was very interesting for me to watch the Democratic debates in 2015 when everyone was running for office, to look at, Senator Jim Webb from Virginia, talk about, I think he was a Vietnam veteran. I fought and I've defended this country. I think our concern is China. We need to focus on reindustrializing at home, and we need to be having a much more serious sober-mindedness out of this. And he was the most sane man in the room. And then to have Hillary Clinton, sort of the embodiment and the heir apparent of this sort of political machine, be the heir nominee, it's her turn, I think was a wake-up call for many. And the same reason why Bernie Sanders's moment of, income inequality, we have to focus on the home, we have to focus on the heart and hearth of these issues. Otherwise, we're not going to compete on the world stage because we're too busy giving the best to the top. And that's why you saw such an overlap between, a small overlap, I should say, of Bernie Sanders supporters for Donald Trump. And regardless of what any of your audience members may think for Trump, I think that coincidentally, the famous liberal filmmaker Michael Moore, Bowling for Columbine, all that stuff, has an explanation that's pretty straightforward. That he focused on the home issues, and I feel like there's a big reason why Barack Obama got elected. You have a financial crisis and two very ugly wars, and we need a shock to the system, and that's really what generated this great new hope, which he literally campaigned on. Barack Obama. But I think people were quickly dissatisfied to see that he, the first thing he does is, we have a surge in Afghanistan. We see the explosion of drone warfare. We see the creation and the leaks of the surveillance state. So all the things that people thought they voted against, when it came to George W. Bush and that neoconservative ideology, you just got that in the progressive, drapings of the Obama administration. So I feel like much in the same, even though, of course, Joe Sobran dies in 2010, I feel like his opinion is best echoed by Patrick Buchanan, who was interviewed by NPR, about Donald Trump, who Trump had kind of famously tanked his 2000 presidential campaign and the reform and that during that election cycle. But, Pat Buchanan sort of, endorsed him and recognized that Trump is sort of a successor to his ideas of focusing at home, securing the border, and taking care of our industrial and manufacturing at home. And he's a rejection of neoconservatism, which Pat Buchanan wrote in 2004, where the right went wrong, which was about how neoconservatism hijacked the Reagan Revolution and has ruined the Bush administration. And so to see these lines of thought come out, I think you're seeing what might be called the Sobran moment, especially right now when it comes to, say, what's America's relationship to Israel supposed to be like? What's our relationship to in industry and politics? And I think that you throw in, say, COVID-19, and there's a great article in the New York Times from, I think her name is Tara Isabella Burton, called When Christianity Gets Weird. And it was about how during COVID, there was this huge push for traditional Christianity. I think it was because Westerners were encountering their own mortality for the first time in their lives, where, oh, death is very real, and we should, get back to the Creator and, set ourselves up and get right with the Lord, right? And I feel like that's definitely why you saw that reaction with the burning through. The problem is, however, is that we can say they've burned through their influence, but even in this administration, or even with how America's Congress still acts, which has a huge, incumbent reelection rate, and people, unless you die or retire, you don't really leave your post. I mean, Senator Feinstein of recent death is a very good example of that. It does illustrate that, yes, there's this public sort of uneasiness with neoconservatism or interventionism or liberal hegemony, but the power structure is still very much interventionist, hegemonic, and neoconservative by nature when it comes to, say, the issue of the Middle East and Israel. So it does kind of prove Sobran's point that, democracy, we have the trappings of it, but we can say we the people, but the people that did the Constitution and our founding were so far different from those people. It's very much similar to what Soren Kierkegaard complained about the public square. We can call something public square, but me standing on a soapbox in the middle of the street in 1680 is way different than me going on Twitter and adding the president of the United States saying, I think he's an idiot for XYZ policy. But we still call that the public square. And that's the problem with democracy, in Joe Sobran's view, that, we're not the, very limited, republic, direct, we didn't have the direct election of senators back then. And now all of a sudden, every election matters, and someone from Virginia can fund a political race in Nevada. Yet we still call that democracy, and that's a huge problem. And it does illustrate the limits of populism and the need to have a strong, cohesive culture that is willing to name and shame these problems. And but right now, I think America is so fractured that, it doesn't matter if I speak to a liberal and we're dissatisfied on like 80% of the issues, but because we disagree on those 20%, we're at each other's throats, and we don't share a common culture. We don't share a common religion. We barely share a common language. And, that's how I think we've seen such a great rapid fire political fracturing in this country is that every election is an existential threat. Every election is the greatest election of our lifetimes. And it very much kind of validates what the German jurist, Carl Schmitt had said, that, if we campaign on humanity, well, that defines what's human and what isn't human. And that allows me to do the greatest amounts of inhumanity towards my political enemies. And we certainly see that play out in both of our lifetimes in Western politics.
Yeah. When I spoke with Gottfried, the topic of Carl Schmitt was brought up, and we had a wonderful conversation about that. Yeah, he's controversial, sure, but a very worthy thinker to read.
Absolutely.
Now, if you can tell from my first and last name, I'm Vietnamese. And of course, we have a rather bitter experience in regards to American interventionism. And I think if I were to conduct like a comprehensive study of anti-Americanism across the world, of course, it would take like different forms and such. Some would be very nasty, like what is existing in China or Iran, or Russia. Some will be rather like benign, like in Europe or in Canada, for example. But I think anti-Americanism would start with one basis. That is, America has too much influence on the world. And I think that is fundamentally true. So I find it to be a sign of significant folly when politicians who are of the Democratic and Republican caught constantly rails about how America should exert itself upon the world. So I suppose there's the idea of the Unip Party, which I have some mixed feelings about. But I think when they think of the Unip Party, they think of this idea that both Republicans and Democrats, they preach the same message in the gospel. They interpret it differently in some respects, but they all agree that America should exert itself upon the world, which the world would say no.
Yeah. I could only imagine what a study of anti-Americanism might look like if you had started with, say, your home country of Vietnam. That would definitely be. I would actually really like to read that paper if it was ever to be written. Maybe there's one out there. I would like that. I think that when people complain of, quote, the Unip Party, you see this a lot. And again, it means totally different things depending on who you ask. So, I mean, if you were to ask someone who's more of a democratic socialist, they would say something along the lines of like, oh, liberals will always side with fascists before they work with Marxists or whatever. Whereas someone like myself might say, well, no, because we never punished any Marxists after the end of the Cold War. I mean, Rosard Legutko's book, The Demon in Democracy, is really good examples of this. All these former communists just became social democrats, so they now participate in politics. Joe Sobran wrote in the notes for The Reactionary for Tomorrow that liberalism is very accommodating towards, Marxism and other progressive ideologies that are anti-liberal. And so when we say the Unip Party, usually we just say that, oh, Democrats and Republicans tend to work together on things that we don't like, which is more of our tax dollars going towards things outside of our borders, or are supporting laws and legislation, which they don't even really legislate anymore. The most honest 5 minutes of American politics I would recommend your listeners to listen to is former Senator Ben Sasse of Nebraska at the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. And he just basically says straight up, Congress doesn't legislate anymore. We write, shell pieces of legislation that tells the executive branch to do X, Y, Z, and the executive branch does it. And if the people don't like it, then somebody sues, and the Supreme Court becomes America's politics of last resort, which is terrible if you are a pro-democracy person, right? Why should unelected 9 individuals on a court be determining the law and the culture of the United States? It should be the people. But because, again, due to special interests and due to lobbying and gerrymandering and an incumbency rate that gets reelected 98% of the time, nothing gets done. And so, yeah, there is sort of this Unip Party where we can disagree on how much gets spent on the military or how much gets spent on environmental regulations, or with Democrats, they're much better at this than Republicans, which is political patronage. Well, we're going to create a task force. I think Biden wants to do some kind of civilian work corps for the environment. And people are like, well, that's a waste of money. And I'm like, no, if I were a Democrat, that's a genius idea for money. I've just created like tens of thousands of jobs for future Democratic voters, because administrators and bureaucrats always vote for the state. So, yeah, I mean, that's smart politics if I were them. But this sort of uniparty complaint is that when times get tough, or we know that some existential issue is happening, like what's happening with Israel, like what's happening in Ukraine, there is little to no room for dissent, just as we saw with the Patriot Act, just as we saw with the consequences of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, that they're going to come together and they're going to vote yes on the issues that count, whether it be terrible budget bills, national defense authorization acts, et cetera, et cetera. That's where you see it from. But again, in America, if you ask that question of, well, what does the Unip Party mean? It will depend very widely on who you ask. A more paleoconservative individual like myself will tell you, like what I've just explained, and whereas a Marxist might say something else, or a more, say, Glenn Youngkin style Republican might have a different answer, and so on. And so there's this, the British actor Hugh Laurie said America's too big to know itself. And I think that there are way more political identities and fracturing in the United States where, if I were to have dinner with someone who disagrees with me, odds are he and I could probably get along on most issues. But we just ravenously get partisan every election cycle, and it makes it very hard for us to live with one another. And it makes it even more difficult when you have one side of this sort of political sphere, primarily the left, that knows how to govern, and knows how to, punish its enemies, reward its friends way better than the Republicans do, to a point where you have numerous writers ranging from Joe Sobran to even the more atheist materialist. He himself is Jewish. Curtis Yarvin, formerly known as Mencius Moldbug, say, no, they're just the outer party, and the outer party's job is to be fake opposition. And so, even two widely different characters, an atheist, materialist, Jewish, neo-reactionary versus a traditional Thomist, Roman Catholic traditionalist like Joe Sobran, we realize that, there is no conservative opposition in the country. And if there is opposition, then you get the Bill Buckley treatment and get called a bigot or something. And that's sort of the mainstream paleo-conservative or quote-unquote right-wing critique of the current conservative movement in the United States.
So a concluding note, I think we're living at rather exciting times for conservatism in America. I think living in Hungary, the excitement is rather doubled, because I think here, with some support from the Orban government, a alternative form of conservatism is being cooked up. And so what I think can only be described as anti-establishment traditionalists, which can be a contradiction in terms, but we can help make sense of that. So with that said, what do you suppose American conservatism should look like?
Oh, that is the $64,000 question. But if you adjust that for inflation, I guess that's like the $6 million question for the game show today. I suppose the real push that we're beginning to emerge, and I think that this flashpoint over Israel has been as well as Ukraine, has been an inflection point to determine the direction of where conservatism goes in the United States. Lest America elects some sort of Francisco Franco character, he emerges out of the demiurge of the great man of history theory, which I doubt will happen. America will, of course, continue to diversify, and the political parties will seek out new political coalitions on how to achieve electoral victory. And the conservative movement today will probably pursue a diversified working class coalition, as the Republicans claim, and it will be primarily a mix of middle America whites, Hispanics of the south of the border. The Rio Grande Valley is a really good example of this. In the United States, in Texas, they went red in 2020, mainly over immigration. And of course, Asians, and primarily Indians in the subcontinent. We see this with like Nikki Haley, the push to kick out Ronna McDaniel of the RNC, to put in Kamit Dillon, another Indian woman, Nikki Haley running. And so you'll see that. As for what I think the conservative movement needs to move towards, is the recognition that if you don't have borders, you don't have a nation state. And America's southern border and its relationship to Central and South America is a national security concern, not just due to immigration, not just due to the drug trade, not just due to human trafficking and the cartels, but also because your largest geopolitical rival in the United States as an entity, as a state, the Chinese, are investing very heavily in Central and South America. America enjoys a relationship with Taiwan and Australia for rare earth minerals and computer manufacturing for microchips. Well, your alternative to lithium resource extraction is the lithium triangle in South America with, Chile, Argentina, and so on. And that's a huge concern, especially because, former Secretary of State and the current climate czar, if he's still in office at this moment, John Kerry, had said that, the Monroe Doctrine doesn't mean anything anymore. So I think that if there's going to be a conservatism, it needs to recognize that we have an ideological dominance of progressivism in this country being taught in academia, in the media, and sponsored by the U.S. federal government and its dollars and policy that advocates for the destruction of Western civilization. I think that James Burnham was very right that liberalism is the suicide of the West. Progressivism, in my view, is civilization, or is suicidal ideation on a civilizational scale. And people want hope and reason to live. And that if you don't give people a reason to live, no one's going to have kids. People are willing to opt to kill themselves and will turn to drink and drugs and abandon God and so on and so forth, as we've seen. And this is why the issues of drug overdoses and so on are getting more political attention these days. And so conservatism needs to focus on some kind of vitality to tell voters and to tell people of all ethnic groups and classes, there is a better way to live. And, despite the fact that Vivek Ramaswamy, who is a practicing Hindu, which I always find it funny when he says God is real. I wish someone on the debate stage would ask him which God does he mean or refer to. But he's saying the things that you should be saying, which is there's reason to live. There are things that we can do to make this place a better country that works and functions. Because, when Palladium magazine is saying, like, we're going to have a huge competency crisis because diversity, equity, and inclusion selects for the least competent people, that's very concerning when you have reports out of major airports saying, like, air traffic controllers have led to near collisions, more than we've ever seen in recent history. So competency, actual border defense, and taking care of how can America promote a reason to live. Because right now, both the left and the right tell people what they want to hear, but neither side offers a reason to live or give people a will to live. And so that, to me, is the biggest existential issue in American and, in general, Western politics. Is there a way to live and to live on and to have a will to live? And so to see, Viktor Orban, talk about pronatalism and being in Hungary and seeing this sort of traditional nationalism, and even in Poland as well, you want to see that replicated in the United States. And if the conservative movement, if whatever's left of it in this country wants to win something, it should actually, ironically, look towards Hungary, look towards Israel, look towards Poland, and see a vital nationalistic, pro-natalist ideology that supports my nation's not an evil place. And that if you come here and if you already live here, you shouldn't be hated for who you are and your history, but you should be given a reason to live. And so far, the conservative movement has not done that. And if anything, the views of Joe Sobran on Christianity, on family, on tradition should be looked at again by even liberals to understand that there are ideas out there, even in the, briar branch of some questionable positions and ideas, that recognizes there's a reason to live. And that's what needs to happen.
Couldn't have put it better myself. Thank you very much, Matthew, the Prudentialist, for joining the show.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.